What unfolded at Angel Stadium on that particular night was not the kind of story that gets buried in the sports section. It was the kind of story that forces an entire sport to stop, look at itself, and reckon with what it stands for. Three separate events collided in a single evening: discriminatory remarks deliberately targeting Shohei Ohtani, an uncovered pattern of calculated foul play aimed at the same man, and a response from Mike Trout so direct, so unambiguous, and so final that it left everyone in that clubhouse completely silent. By the time the night was over, two players had been separated from the team, an independent review had been launched, and the Los Angeles Angels had become the center of the most serious controversy baseball had seen in years. To understand why Mike Trout's reaction carried the weight that it did, you have to understand what he and Shohei Ohtani built together over nearly a decade inside that Angels clubhouse. Trout arrived in Anaheim as a teenager and became, within a few years, the most decorated position player of his generation. By the time Ohtani landed in 2018, Trout was already the unquestioned leader of the franchise, not through speeches or self-promotion, but through consistency, professionalism, and a quiet standard of excellence that set the tone for everyone around him. Ohtani arrived from Japan as a two-way experiment that no one in modern baseball had attempted seriously, and within his first full season he had made believers out of skeptics across the entire sport. What they built together was not just a professional partnership. It was a culture of mutual respect inside a clubhouse that, despite never winning a championship, maintained its dignity and its standards. Trout was never the loudest voice in the room. He led by example and let his performance do the talking. Ohtani, despite becoming one of the most famous athletes on the planet, remained approachable, humble, and deeply committed to his teammates. Together, they represented the best version of what a professional baseball environment could look like. When Ohtani signed with the Los Angeles Dodgers ahead of the 2024 season in the largest contract in professional sports history, $700 million over 10 years, the reaction inside the Angels organization was, for the most part, one of understanding. Years of failed championship attempts had defined both of their careers in Anaheim. Trout personally understood the decision. He had watched Ohtani give everything he had to a franchise that could never quite build the right team around him. There was no bitterness from Trout, no resentment, and no public drama. He accepted it with the same quiet professionalism that had defined his entire career, but not everyone within the Angels organization felt the same way. Among the Angels roster were two young players still working to establish themselves at the major league level. Neither had reached the kind of security that comes with years of proven production. Both were still, in the truest sense, fighting for their place in the game, and both had developed over time a deep and irrational resentment toward Shohei Ohtani. The roots of that resentment were not difficult to identify in hindsight. Jealousy is not uncommon in professional sports environments, particularly when one individual reaches a level of attention and acclaim that feels, to those around him, almost incomprehensible. But what these two players carried went beyond professional jealousy or competitive insecurity. There was something darker at the core of it, something that would eventually reveal itself in a way that shocked even the most experienced members of the Angels organization. They had been carrying this toxicity for longer than anyone realized, and on this particular night that toxicity finally spilled into the open. The first event of the evening took place hours before the game, behind closed doors in what the two players apparently believed was a private setting. They were wrong. The remarks they made were deliberately targeted at Shohei Ohtani. They were ethnically charged and deeply offensive. This was not a case of language being misinterpreted, context being stripped away, or a poorly worded comment taken out of proportion. The words were intentional. The target was specific, and the nature of what was said left absolutely no room for ambiguity about what was behind them. When the remarks began to spread through the clubhouse, and in a professional sports environment very little stays contained for long, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Veteran players who had spent years in the game and had seen plenty of locker room conflict were visibly disturbed. Coaching staff members who heard the details were deeply shaken. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse shifted instantly from the focused, competitive energy of a pre-game environment to something heavy, tense, and deeply uncomfortable. Nobody who heard what had been said tried to pretend it was acceptable, but the discriminatory remarks turned out to be only the beginning. As the evening progressed and the initial shock of the remarks was still settling over the clubhouse, a second and far more calculated pattern of behavior began to surface. What was uncovered was not a single incident or a moment of poor judgment. It was a deliberate, ongoing scheme involving multiple incidents carried out over a period of time. The behavior had been structured specifically to avoid detection, and it had been aimed, consistently and without exception, at a single target: Shohei Ohtani. The full scope of what had been happening, for how long, through what methods, and with what level of deliberate planning, produced a reaction in the clubhouse that went far beyond the initial anger over the discriminatory remarks. What replaced that anger was something closer to disbelief, followed by a fury that was absolute and unanimous. This was not a violation of baseball rules alone. It was a violation of the basic standards of human decency that any professional environment is supposed to uphold. And then Mike Trout found out the full truth. There's a version of Mike Trout that the baseball world has come to know over more than a decade. Calm, measured, deeply professional, entirely uninterested in public drama. He is not a man who seeks confrontation. He is not a man who burns bridges. Nearly 15 years as a major leaguer, he had never been associated with the kind of moment that was about to unfold. What changed in him when the complete picture was laid out was not performance or calculation. It was something raw, genuine, and uncompromising that replaced his usual composure, something that had nothing to do with optics or how the moment would be perceived and everything to do with what was right. He did not pause. He did not consult anyone. He did not craft a measured, carefully worded response. He went directly to the two players and confronted them face to face. What Trout said in that confrontation was unambiguous. He called their behavior disgusting, cowardly, and beneath the dignity of a professional baseball player. He defended Ohtani's character directly, not in vague or diplomatic terms, but specifically and passionately. He reminded them, and everyone else within earshot, exactly what Shohei Ohtani has meant to this sport. The records he has set, the barriers he has broken, the standard of excellence he has maintained while carrying himself with a grace and humility that almost no athlete at his level has managed to sustain. And then came the declaration that sent shockwaves through the entire baseball world. Trout announced that he was completely and permanently finished with both players, not a cooling-off period. Not a temporary separation pending a conversation and an apology. A full and final severance made clearly, stated directly, and delivered without hesitation. The room fell completely silent. Mike Trout was not just speaking for himself. He was speaking for the conscience of the entire sport. Word spread through the Angels roster almost immediately. In a clubhouse already shaken by two consecutive revelations, the discriminatory remarks and the pattern of calculated foul play, Trout's declaration became the flashpoint that turned shock into action. One by one, then in groups, players made their way toward Ohtani. The atmosphere was unlike anything typically seen in a professional sports setting. Some players were visibly angry. Others were emotional in ways that went beyond anger, the kind of raw, authentic response that cannot be staged or manufactured. What was on display in that clubhouse was real, and everyone who witnessed it understood it. The message being sent to Ohtani was clear and collective. The uniform he wore now was different, the city was different, the organization was different, but what had been built between these men during years of shared struggle, shared celebration, and genuine friendship did not disappear because of a contract or a trade. He still wears Dodger blue, but he remained one of them in every way that mattered. And targeting him with racial discrimination and with deliberate foul play was completely and entirely unacceptable. Ohtani received the support with quiet dignity and genuine warmth. There were handshakes, there were embraces, there were private conversations that no microphone captured and no camera recorded. And throughout all of it, he carried himself with precisely the grace and composure that had defined every chapter of his career. It was that composure, that refusal to be diminished even in a moment designed to diminish him, that made the whole scene more powerful than any single speech or statement could have been. That is who Shohei Ohtani has always been, and on this night the whole world was reminded of it. The Los Angeles organization did not move slowly. Within hours of the events coming to the attention of team leadership, official processes had been set in motion. Statements were being prepared. Internal disciplinary mechanisms were activated immediately. Both players were removed from all team activities pending a full organizational review, a step that made public in unmistakable terms where the franchise stood on everything that had occurred. Major League Baseball's governing bodies were notified. An independent review was launched. Those involved in the review were given access to a comprehensive body of evidence that covered both the discriminatory remarks and the documented pattern of foul play. The assessment from those conducting the review was unambiguous. The discriminatory remarks alone were sufficient to warrant serious disciplinary action. Combined with the evidence of deliberate, calculated behavior targeting Ohtani over an extended period, the case was described as comprehensive and damning. The Angels organization committed publicly to full cooperation with all relevant authorities and complete transparency throughout the process. There was no attempt to manage the story, minimize the severity of what had occurred, or protect the two players from accountability. The franchise's position was clear from the beginning. What had happened was indefensible, and the response would reflect that. When Mike Trout stood in front of the media following the events of that night, the composure he projected was not the easy, familiar composure of a man in a comfortable situation. It was something different, the quiet, settled strength of someone who had faced a genuinely difficult moment and made a clear decision about where he stood. He had not hedged, he had not calculated. He had responded with his values, and now he was prepared to explain them publicly. His statements to the press were direct and unambiguous. Baseball, he said, is built on respect, respect for the game, respect for the uniform, and respect for every competitor who competes within it, regardless of where they come from, what language they speak, or what country they were born in. What had happened inside that clubhouse was not a gray area. It was a violation of everything the sport is supposed to stand for, and it deserved to be treated as exactly that. He expressed his hope that the outcome of the situation, the disciplinary action, the review, the organizational response, would send a message that extended far beyond the Angels clubhouse. Not just to the players involved, but to anyone in any professional sports environment who believed that this kind of behavior could be carried out without consequence. Ohtani said nothing publicly in response to the events of that night. He didn't need to. The image of his former teammates surrounding him, choosing him, standing for him, making their position known without ambiguity, communicated something that no press conference statement could have matched. The events of that evening at Angel Stadium did not emerge from nowhere. They were the product of attitudes that had been allowed to develop in private, resentments that had been left to fester, and a pattern of behavior that had been deliberately concealed. What the night revealed was not just the toxicity of two individuals, but the importance of what happens when that toxicity is confronted directly and without compromise. Mike Trout's response, immediate, unambiguous, and permanent, established a standard. It demonstrated that leadership in a professional environment is not only about performance or strategy or public presence. It is about what you're willing to do when something genuinely wrong is happening in front of you. Trout did not look away. He did not wait for someone else to handle it. He stepped forward and handled it himself, with the full weight of 15 years of earned credibility behind every word he said. Shohei Ohtani, for his part, responded to the entire episode with the same dignity that has characterized everything he has done since arriving in American baseball in 2018. He did not lash out. He did not seek additional attention. He accepted the solidarity of his former teammates with warmth and grace and moved forward. That is who Shohei Ohtani has always been. In trying to diminish the greatest player on the planet, they only made him look greater.